I popped over her angel.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon session. Again, my name is Gino Gravetti. I'm the Director of University Ministry at Cardinals Church University. Regrettably, Pamela Say cannot join us this afternoon. So we will begin with the presentation from Professor of English Matt King, who will be presenting Questioning Community, Social Media as a Space for Communities of Critique.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all again. My name is Dr. Matt King. I am indeed a professor over in the English department. I'm serving as chair of the English department. I'm disappointed that Pamela's not able to join us this afternoon. Not only because I'm not sure that I have an hour's worth of stuff to carry this whole session, but also because I hadn't met her. I didn't know her work, but finding out that I was going to be, when I was expecting to come alongside of her, I looked up her work and I thought it was I thought mine would have, I was hoping my presentation would be a good fit following hers. So I will, again, I'm disappointed not to hear her talk. But I do hope that, not that I can speak to what she was going to say, but having looked at some of the work that she does with Orato Media, is that right? That is the sort of work that she's doing. I see it's very much sort of speaking to what I'm hoping to accomplish in this talk. All right, so when I submitted a proposal for the conference, my hope was that I could provide something of an outsider perspective on the questions of authentic community and leadership. Again, here at Bonaventure, I teach classes in the English department with part of my work focusing on digital writing and digital rhetoric, which includes a consideration of how digital technologies and platforms allow for the formation of different types of communities and communication practices within those communities. Now, while I appreciate the concerns that arise around digital culture and what Andrew Gustafson referred to last night as virtual society, I also study how digital spaces, including social media, not only perpetuate threats to the common good, but draw attention to these threats, challenge them, and push back against them. And as my title suggests. I ended up, when I was developing the presentation, I ended up focusing a little bit less on social media exactly. So I'm not going to speak a whole lot to social media. Social media is sort of lurking in the background here. That being said, I'm certainly happy to discuss that more since we will have so much time to talk when I'm done here. But generally speaking, I'm thinking of things along the lines of what's come to be known as cancel culture, and whether or not that is the best phrase to sort of capture what's actually happening in social media when people are offering these sorts of public critiques. So to turn to the first part of my title, Questioning Community. In my academic world, scholars are often suspicious of terms like authenticity and community, quick to consider how these concepts can work to exclude people and perspectives, often in service of policing and marginalizing people along identity lines of race, gender, sexuality, class, religion, politics, etc. Some rhetorical theorists invert the question of community, arguing that community is not something we create so much as something that happens to us, an inherent part of our being in the world. We are in community with each other simply by existing together. This more fundamental understanding of community also suggests an ethical obligation. We have a responsibility to others to recognize the range of experiences, perspectives, and needs that people bring to the table with them. This concept of community encourages us to ask not who belongs, but who has been left out, not welcomed in, not recognized. From this perspective, any attempt to carve out a more specific understanding of community, our Bonaventure community, a national community, a Twitter or Reddit community, a community of people invested in leadership and authentic community, is a rhetorical act. This sort of community does not exist until we name it as such and have some understanding as to who belongs and who doesn't. We identify and claim these communities for a purpose, to name a point of connection and shared experience. And we might have good reasons for doing so. Such communities allow us to do things together that we might otherwise not. But they nonetheless work through a process of exclusion, of forgetting our more fundamental being together, which is dangerous when community becomes a tool for marginalizing people, for dominance, oppression, and violence. So my main argument regarding our larger concern today with leadership is thus to note the importance of leadership that not only works to build and facilitate a sense of authentic community, but also that can see the limits of the communities it fosters. Leadership that cultivates practices for listening and engaging with people and perspectives that go unrecognized within the bounds of a community. An authentic community from this perspective would be one capable of change and revision, of working toward an active and ongoing sense of inclusion. I'm interested in considering how leadership can facilitate and perhaps also get in the way of such an understanding of community. And again, I had a note here where I sort of made a reference to Pamela Say and her work. So when I discovered that I would be presenting alongside Pamela, of course that didn't work out, learning more about her work, again, with Arato World Media, I was excited and humbled to learn that what I consider to be my outsider perspective on leadership, I see sort of already embodied in the work that she does. Arato Media claims to tell the stories of the witnesses, the whistleblowers, the victims. It's a company that gives voice to the voiceless in a sea of misinformation. So again, I just sort of see the work that she's doing on that website as sort of fitting with what I'm hoping to say about leadership here. So to develop my argument about leadership and community, I will first turn to work in feminist theory, namely the writing of Sara Ahmed, a British academic, in her work on institutional practices that purport to address issues of harassment and marginalization within an institutional or corporate community, but that actually serve to perpetuate inequalities and power imbalances, maintaining the status quo of the community. Ahmed helps us understand how institutions prove remarkably resilient, effectively absorbing any challenges to the institutional community's core people, practices, and policies, and reframing those challenges to preserve the institution's integrity. Again, for the larger purposes of my argument, I believe Ahmed's work helps us to speak to failures in leadership to achieve an inclusive community. Failures to address the sort of diminishment that takes place through harassment, marginalization, and leaving people powerless to address communal concerns. Or alternately, Ahmed's work helps us to see how institutional leadership does not fail to produce a more authentic and inclusive community, but often intentionally works against attempts to address concerns in order to preserve the institutional community. In Ahmed's words, power works to make it hard to challenge how power works. Ahmed has two works that study this work of institutional preservation. Her 2012 book, On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life, and last year's Complaint. In these texts, Ahmed traces two related institutional phenomena. First, the use of diversity and inclusion practices and policies to avoid substantially addressing diversity concerns. The use of the language of diversity to avoid using the language of racism and other forms of oppression. Those so-called negative words that are about rendering the institution accountable for reproducing violence. And second, the framing of policies and procedures for addressing complaints that in practice become techniques for stopping complaints and complainers. So combined, these institutional strategies serve to redirect, deflect, and dismiss complaints and other attempts to address problems. So to further explain, I'll just elaborate on each point a little further. So again, in the first book, On Being Included, Ahmed interviewed people she identifies as diversity practitioners, people who have responsibility within an institution or organization to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As she describes, being a diversity practitioner means you are in effect appointed by an employer to transform the employer. It is a difficult position. One practitioner described the job as a banging your head against the brick wall job. Even if you are appointed by an institution to transform that institution, it does not mean the institution is willing to be transformed. In fact, many practitioners encounter resistance to their work. Diversity is work because of that resistance. You have to find ways to get through because you are blocked. This is why I call diversity workers institutional plumbers. They have to work out where the blockage is or what stops something, for example, a new policy from moving through the system. That's the end of that quote. For Ahmed, the hiring of diversity practitioners becomes a means of avoiding doing the actual work of diversity and inclusion. Organizations hire or assign people to do this work, but resist the change that such work calls for. For the purposes of the institutions, the diversity practitioners themselves, who are often Black and or women, embody the diversity the institution aims to achieve and thus serve as evidence of their success at addressing the concerns of diversity and inclusion. The performance of doing diversity work stands in for the actual transformation of the institutional community. The other leadership strategy Ahmed considers for preserving the status quo of institutions and organizations centers around complaint. Again, Ahmed studies this in last year's book titled Complaint. As described by Maya Binyam in the Paris Review, in the book, Ahmed collects oral and written testimony from dozens of people who have experienced sexual abuse, racist harassment, or bullying within universities, and have chosen either to go through the institution's formal grievance procedures or to challenge those procedures altogether. Over and over, complaints are either discouraged before they're made or welcomed in the abstract, but deemed not credible in practice. Meanwhile, the ugly qualities of the incidents complained about often attach themselves to those complaining. They are both diminished and demonized. On the one hand, their concerns are deemed inconsequential. They're trying to make something out of nothing. And on the other, they're presented as malicious and threatening, as if they have the power to single-handedly take the whole institution down. From this perspective, to identify and address a problem is to be a problem. Ahmed's work thus points to the limits of leadership to address ongoing problems within a community. Not only do institutional communities become safe spaces for ongoing instances of harassment, marginalization, and abuse, but they further work to minimalize, demonize, and dismiss those who would challenge these things. On the one hand, the language of diversity gets used to neutralize issues without addressing them. On the other hand, complaint gets used against the complainant as evidence of something wrong with the individual rather than with the institution itself. Interestingly, Ahmed finds that a different sort of community, an alternative community, begins to develop among people who are working for equity and inclusion, who are doing the work of complaining and calling attention to institutional problems. She finds that much of the work of revolution comes from what you learn by trying to build more just worlds alongside other people. It's the sociability of complaint that leads it in a direction similar to a protest. You find your co-complainers, the people who get it, who have been there, your comrades. Some people cannot survive these institutions. Some people do not survive them. It is a fundamentally life-affirming task to build institutions that are not dependent on the diminishment of the life capacities of others. Again, for all its problems, I do believe that social media embodies the potential for facilitating this sort of community, in part because it is so inclusive. Of course, this inclusivity means that social media also allows for any number of things that threaten community. Misinformation, bullying, toxicity and harassment, echo chambers. But it also provides a space for calling these things out, for addressing them and drawing attention to them, for creating the sort of collectivity of complaint and critique that Ahmed describes. So for the last part of my talk, I want to quickly consider an example that I believe sort of captures the spirit of Ahmed's notion of a collectivity of complaint. I'm thinking here of the recent efforts of an independent Amazon union led by worker Chris Smalls. We see in this example both a failure of institutional leadership and the success of a different sort of leadership, grounded in complaint and challenges to the institution. Smalls began a protest in March 2020 in response to a lack of protective gear and hazard pay for employees at the beginning of the pandemic. In response, Amazon leadership, including Jeff Bezos, discussed the situation, and Amazon's general counsel, David Sapolsky, shared a memo that was leaked within the company and to the media. In the memo, Sapolsky advised that we should spend the first part of our response to Smalls and his protest of the situation. We should spend the first part of our response strongly laying out the case for why the organizers' conduct was immoral, unacceptable, and arguably illegal in detail, and only then follow with our usual talking points about worker safety. Make him the most interesting part of the story, and if possible, make him the face of the entire union organizing movement. He's not smart or articulate, and to the extent the press wants to focus on us versus him, we will be in a much stronger PR position than simply explaining for the umpteenth time how we're trying to protect workers. Of course, Smalls did prove himself to be smart, articulate, and highly effective at organizing workers. Since that time, Smalls initiated and serves as president of the Amazon Labor Union, with his efforts ultimately proving successful, as just last week, Amazon workers in Staten Island voted to unionize. It's also worth noting, though, that Sapolsky, a few months later, back in 2020, and in response to the Black Lives Matter protests that began themselves in response to the murder of George Floyd, wrote an accompanying email that, like many of you, I have been reading and listening to many voices responding to this most recent spate of racial injustice. I don't presume to be able to add much to those conversations, which is why I've hesitated to write until now. But I do tend to agree with those who argue that the most constructive things that people who are privileged not to face this oppression in their daily lives can do, at least in the short term, are listen and learn from those who do. Redouble our commitment to be more effective anti-racist allies and advocates, and support organizations and individuals seeking to address and mitigate racial oppression, police violence, and structural racism in our society. So again, he has sort of like the perfect sort of like institutional response to that. It sounds very, it sounds like he's fully sort of embraced his position and positioned himself as somebody who can't fully understand but wants to listen and hear. But again, to my mind, Sapolsky's message here perfectly embodies the failures of leadership and community described by Ahmed. Sapolsky claims to support calls for justice, for listening to people who have been marginalized and subject to oppression and violence. But his legal leadership in Amazon, in dealing with Chris Smalls, deliberately draws on racist stereotypes to dismiss Smalls and his efforts to make Amazon a safer and more fair community for its employees. So again, just sort of take a step back here. Again, my hope is that Sarah Ahmed's attention to failures of leadership and examples like Chris Small's of a leadership that works to question community, give us one vision for what it might look like to work toward a more authentic community. At this point, I was fully prepared to say, Pamela, I would really love to hear more about your work. You have more experience with this. This is your bread and butter. So tell us more about your work. But I am happy to further discuss my work, to take your questions, and we have so much time that I hope it can be more of a group conversation than just me talking further. But I'm certainly happy to get questions. Sure, Paul.
So I have two questions, and they're not even close enough to say that it's a two-part question. So
Okay.
it has to be two questions.
Okay.
We have plenty of time.
Good.
The first is, someone said to me not too long ago that whenever we do hiring in academia, we always say they make a good cultural fit,
Mhm.
right? And this person said to me, that's a horrible term.
Mhm.
And it's because cultural fit has been used as a way of avoiding diversity.
Mhm.
Like we could, and I realized that at the time in my past it was used against me, and I didn't recognize it.
Right.
So I'm wondering your thoughts on that, because when I think cultural fit, I mean you're an academic who likes to do research, but who goes a little more toward teaching, so therefore academically and intellectually you're a really good fit. But I think of it as the institution's culture. But this person said to me, no, that's code for you're not the either religious, racial, gender fit that we're looking for. What are your thoughts on that? Have you heard that?
No, I would agree exactly. I participated in Dr. Megan Walsh, who's currently serving as the interim dean of arts and sciences. She had a sort of bias in hiring practices workshop in the fall for departments that were conducting searches here. That's the sort of thing that one of the things that we talked about. Sure. And I guess I can sort of see both sides. Like, right, you want to, like, there is a sense of an institutional culture of a campus culture for here at Bonaventure, and in some sense, you want people who feel like they will fit here, and you want to feel like, I think as some people sort of talk about it, you want to be able to have a colleague that you can imagine working with for the next decade or two or three. So, right, that sense of a fit certainly makes sense. But I would agree with exactly what you're saying, Paul, that, like, yeah, it very easily becomes an opportunity to discriminate, to dismiss. And another thing, even if there's not a sense of, even if there's a sense in which, okay, we're not going to discriminate against people and say, well, they're not, even if we're doing a better job, even if we get to a point where we're doing a better job not imposing a sort of like cultural fit and saying you have to believe something in particular, or you have to look a certain way. Even just sort of imagining the way that your culture might not be the best fit for other people, and that what does it mean to sort of like reframe your own thinking about your culture, even if it's not a matter of saying like you have to fit our culture in order for us to accept you or hire you, even if it's a thinking of like, okay, we're willing to be more open-minded. Is the culture itself going to be able to sort of accept or be a good fit for other people? How do you not only recognize the limits of the thinking of a cultural fit, but also how do you sort of reframe your culture such that it can be something that a diverse group of candidates might look at and see that's a space that I can fit in. And I feel like in a place like Bonaventure, to some extent, we're sort of limited in terms of like we are where we are. We have the community that we have. We live in the area that we live in. So there's not things that we can do to change that, but we can at least be mindful of. Again, I think it just sort of raises a question in terms of like, right, what sorts of things can we be doing to sort of demonstrate that we are a culture that can be a fit for a range of diverse applicants, whatever, in a true sense of, not just a marketing term, but like a, nothing against marketing, but. I don't know if that
Yeah,
answers.
that does, yeah, so
Okay.
it sounds like you look at it the way I do, it's like, I think of it as intellectual cultural fit,
Mhm.
or intellectual fit, maybe that's the better term,
Right.
but I never thought of it as, yeah, maybe that could be used for bad purpose.
Mhm.
And, it sounds like you kind of, I see both sides as well, and it's really
Right.
interesting, so thank you.
Sure. And again, I feel like it's hard to know where you draw that line, because like, at some point, there is a candidate who is just like, is just not going to be a good fit. It's not going to be a good experience for anyone. They're just not going to be, one way or another, it's just not right. But again, I think part of the challenge that I'm trying to point to is when we have a sense of, if we're bringing our own biases to what constitutes an intellectual or cultural fit, then that's at least an opportunity to sort of like just check in on this and
Right.
see, and to imagine what, how it might be a fit in a different way, or if we can be more inclusive.
Or bringing someone in who you wouldn't normally think would make a good cultural fit. Maybe that's an opportunity to expand your
Right.
culture so that
Right.
now more people will be.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to sort of expand on that, in a search process here or any university, all of that starts right at the resume review. It's not just about when you have somebody here on campus for an interview and you're trying to decide. There are judgments being made at every step of the process. And I think that idea of fit is always, and I think we probably have a lot of preconceived biases there. This person is from that, graduated from this school. Yeah, it's not going to work here.
And sometimes just
They're
how
from
you,
this part of the country.
how you can create the job advertisement.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking for specific experience or some skills, you could immediately exclude some non-traditional candidates or younger candidates or female candidates, or just by how you craft what you're looking for, just to have that bias. We've gone through 2 searches in 2 years. So some of this is has been on our forefront too, is how do you craft what you're looking for,
Right.
that you want suitable candidates or candidates that could be successful here without already initially limiting your pool so small, or to exclude some from the very start.
Right. And potentially even starting before you're even in the job search process. Like, are we creating within our department, within our schools, are we creating a culture that is going to be welcoming, or is going to send the message that we are prepared to, or invested in welcoming a broad range of applicants, that we are doing things that a diverse pool of applicants would feel like, okay, they're doing things that speak to me and the work that I do as a person that I am. Yeah. Sure.
I'm not a social media individual.
Right.
But can you see an end to this ever widening circle of social media? Because it seems that anytime you introduce or defend something else that happens over here or there, a new level starts.
Right.
And what it does is it creates further and further division.
Right.
And you never really get into the crux of whatever issue it is. Do you see an end to, if there can be an end to how we critique through social media? I include television, radio, the phone, and social media, because all 3 of those mediums can take a person here or there. And unfortunately, none of us can get away from all those 3. And no one reads the newspaper. Right? So I asked, do you see, is there an end to this, or does it get progressively worse until no one listens to me.
No. And thank you for that question. I think that's a great point. And that's definitely one of the concerns here is, right, where do you draw the line between like what I'm calling like the community of critique, or that Ahmed would frame in terms of complaint? Where do you say, okay, this part of the conversation is productive in doing something that's actually helping us address concerns, whereas this part of the conversation is just noise, it's just vitriol, it's just divisive. I don't know that there's a good way to draw that line. Here's how I would frame it. I honestly don't know if there's an end to that. The hope that I have is that, again, this sort of critique, the sort of divisiveness that we see on social media. And again, this was a term that I threw out when I was first starting, but this notion of like cancel culture, for example, like that's something that sort of emerges out of some of these online conversations where it seems like people are using social media as just an opportunity to just yell at each other. And some people just sort of call that cancel culture. You're just trying to cancel somebody, you're just trying to silence somebody, you're just trying to get somebody removed from their job, rather than actually have some sort of productive conversation. The hope that I have here is that I do feel like that conversation is being pushed or is challenging some of the media leaders, both individuals and larger corporations, that tend to sort of dominate those conversations. So for example, some of the other examples that I was thinking about when I was preparing the talk that were a little bit more focused on social media were things like so for example, a few years ago, a letter appeared in Harper's Magazine. There was a group of authors who were speaking out against cancel culture. The New York Times editorial board, I think it was within the last month or so, had a similar sort of editorial sort of like one of the main things that they were considering was ways in which they did a study where they, from their perspective, they sort of determined that people in general were less likely to share their perspectives, less likely to say something out of fear of somebody disagreeing with them. And another issue, sometimes it happens at universities around, like I believe, I'm forgetting exactly what happened, but at Harvard University, there was a professor who had been, I believe, sort of censured for sexual harassment. And initially, other professors sort of came to the defense of their colleague. But then there was sort of pushback on social media to let many people sort of reconsider that. And so what I sort of see in several of these examples, and I think at least a lot of the conversation, so I'm somebody who spends a lot of time on Twitter. Twitter is sort of like one of the main spaces, and there's a number of academics and activists and others who frequently use Twitter as a space to sort of share some of these positions. So at least one of the things that people in these conversations are sort of voicing and seeing is a sense in which sort of the establishment of, whether it's in terms of corporations, media corporations, even elite academic institutions, New York Times is sort of like the national paper of record, that there is a sense in which the people who are used to leading the conversation, who are used to being the main people who are sort of getting to sort of lead public discourse, that they feel that it's not so much that cancel culture and social media is becoming a problem, so much as it is sort of dislodging those people from their sort of established places. So I guess, and again, I'm not sure if this exactly speaks to your question, but I guess that's part of my hope here is, I don't know that there's necessarily an end to the sort of social media cycle of just ongoing divisiveness, but I at least sort of hope that one of the things that it's doing is sort of challenging some of the main established points of leadership in these conversations that when those sort of cultural figureheads get challenged, that might sort of open up a new sort of framework in which these sorts of conversations happen.
Well, I appreciate the answer. I think I almost asked it rhetorically because I think we're probably beyond the Fahrenheit 4 or 5
Right, sure.
model where there's a complete reliance on what you hear and you don't triangulate. And
Right.
so it's just a continual vortex down. And I listened to Dr. Gustafson, I'm sorry, Dr. Gustafson last night. He and I are probably one of the last two who read the Wall Street Journal. So they throw it on my driveway at 5 o'clock and I read it. And probably the person delivering it's like, who reads it? But I read a newspaper. It's very challenging to look at the news or listen to talk radio.
Right.
Or I rarely get on my phone 64 times like I do one of the presenters on average a day. But you cannot get away from what other people think. And with no kind of triangulation, reference, and it has permeated every single aspect of how we live. And so I think I asked the question because I was looking at the title of Communities of Critique. I don't know if they get any better. I don't know if that's the rock bottom, whatever that could be.
Right.
Before it ever comes back up, but it is concerning. And, I probably did ask you before, but thank you for the.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for your question. And just, I guess, one other point to just sort of follow up on that. To my mind, the divisiveness that we see on social media is something that started in more mainstream media. That's not something that only just sort of popped up just because of social media. That sort of divisiveness, I feel like we see as media more and more over the last few decades has become more, not that it's necessarily entirely this way, not that it wasn't the case before, but as it becomes more and more about entertainment, as it becomes more and more about getting views, as it becomes more as more and more people get their news online and don't get the Wall Street Journal delivered at home, and therefore newspapers have to have different sort of funding models that push further and further away from traditional journalism. That sort of cycle or tendency that we see happening in sort of more established mainstream traditional media, that there's a sort of emerging sort of divisiveness and toxicity that's been happening in that realm for the last few decades. And again, I think that there are ways that social media feeds into that, but my hope is, or there's at least ways that social media can be a way of pushing back against that, such that maybe we'll see, I guess I'm hopeful that, I largely share your concern, so I use hopeful with like an asterisk there, but like, I guess I can imagine the possibility for what's going to happen if enough people sort of get tired of, if this isn't just like an ongoing endless cycle of divisiveness on social media, but if it actually sort of on some level leads to like, okay, this has to fundamentally change our sort of established media culture as well. I guess that's my hope.
Hey, Matt, I have a question for you and the whole group here, and I'm going to flunk the knowing their names test, but about maybe a year ago, I was at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center in San Francisco, and the speaker, I think his name's Tom Siebel or something close to it, he's a very prestigious, long-term, very successful Silicon Valley executive, and he was telling a story. He was saying, and I don't know this person's name for sure at all. And he said, there was a person I've always wanted to meet that I had the highest opinion of. And I was at an event in New York City, and he was at a conference and he was sitting at a table, and the seat next to him was empty. So he said, I went down and sat next to him, and we're having a conversation. And here's the one thing he chose to share with the audience that this man that he's so impressed with, that person said, when we look back in history, we're going to realize that the worst thing happened to mankind was social media. And he said, look, I don't really know why he said that, but because of who he is, I just wanted you all to be aware that that's his opinion. What do you think of that?
I'm not a historian, so.
No, I mean, his president, he said.
Right. No, I appreciate it.
Or anyone else. And like I said, he said, I don't know why he said it,
Right.
because of who he is, I just wanted you to be aware, that's what he thinks.
I mean, there's so many different ways. I mean, yeah, sure. Paul, go
I
ahead.
was confused. I want to add something. Okay?
Yeah, sure. Go
No,
for it.
you go first.
We have plenty of time, so I think this is a question where we could have lots of input on this. So who wants to speak first?
I'll just note that I feel like I see where that observation is going. I feel like there's a number of, okay, so the way that I see that going is right, that it does create the exact sort of like, that it becomes this sort of, it becomes this whole other part of our experience that just sort of diverts our attention, that changes our relationship, that changes our ability to have, again, what we consider to be sort of like a productive public discourse. The what we imagine our society to be based on in terms of some sense of, right, we can all read the newspaper and have some shared sense of like, these are the issues of the day, this is the important news of the day. We have some sort of common ground that we sort of build our society, build our democracy upon, and that social media fundamentally sort of challenges a lot of those things. It changes our relationship, it changes our attention, it changes the way and our ability to have those sorts of conversations. So that's my guess in terms of what you might mean about that. The thing for me is I think that there's any number of assumptions that sort of go along with that I'm not sure whether or not I would entirely agree with. One of the, I mean, in the earlier days of like Web 2.0 with blogs and more sort of public participation, there was certainly like this sort of like utopian sense that the internet was going to be this like even stronger democratic space. Where everyone was going to get to be able to share their perspectives, where everyone was just going to be able to have this ongoing dialogue, that more voices would be joining the conversation, more people would have access. There would be greater opportunities for greater inclusion, things along these lines. So again, a couple things come to mind for me about social media. Part of it is the role of the difference between it being a space for people to actually share and communicate and have some sort of public dialogue versus it being a space for companies to collect data and use it as for marketing, for advertising, for surveillance. So there's sort of like two different understandings of what social media is actually about. And again, I think that there's potentially a larger critique there to be made of, you know, that sort of the assumption that social media is displacing a prior sort of like broader civic community sort of assumes that prior civic community itself was working well, and that might be worth questioning further too. Yeah.
So there's a debate. I'm not an expert on this debate, but I've heard it several times that says that it's a debate about whether technology changed the way we communicate, or the other side, which has a really strong, you know, the expert makes some really strong cases for it, is that society was moving in a way that develops technology so that we can do these things. So it's not that social media created the discourse that we read on it, but sociologically, we as a world, and in some degrees as a country, develop the technology to be able to have the discourse that we have now. So it's the other way around as most people think about it.
Yeah, and listening to you, it reminded me of a quote from I think his name's Richard Farson, who wrote a book, I think in the early 90s, called Management of the Absurd. And he said, we think we're in the saddle riding technology, but the truth is technology is in the saddle riding mankind. And he gave some examples. Like, imagine getting rid of your car, trying to get rid of, or today you'd say your cell phone. Just say, I'm not going to use a cell phone. It's impossible. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I would, the experts who make a really good case would argue that we created the cell phone to do the things that we as a society aim to do and want to do.
Yeah, but then I think.
Then it's the other way around.
I think he would say yes, but then he'd call it the iatrogenic effect, the unintended consequences. Like I remember right now, he'd say like, for example, we have air conditioners that pollute the air. And then we have pesticides that poison the soil. So he said technology always backfires, and there's always the adverse unintended consequences.
Which is why everyone should watch the movie Social Dilemma. I have my students watch that.
Don't point at me when you.
You brought it up yesterday. It's everyone.
I heard him, I heard him.
That's it. You have this AI. So what brought us from your point, everyone thought the internet was going to be this great utopian place where everyone could have their own place to say things. Artificial intelligence is which artificial intelligence was used to create profit. Is what made the internet kind of what it is today.
Right.
That's what social work is about.
I'm sorry, did you have a question first?
Well, no, I don't have a question. Well, maybe I do have a question.
Or thought?
Everything is a question.
But you had a contribution.
To sort of, I think, follow on Paul's comments, earlier comments, and maybe to Mark's question. I'm not convinced that, certainly I'm not at all convinced that social media is the cause of much of anything. And so I don't think it's the worst that's ever happened to mankind.
Yeah.
And partly I say that because I think there's some evidence, at least observable evidence, that the divisions that are magnified on social media exist anyway. And so there's something more fundamental going on, and I don't know if it's even epistemological. But I was thinking about the pandemic, and if you were, seems to me, if you were reasonably open-minded and reasonably trusting of folks that might be more expert than you, it was not that difficult to navigate the pandemic in terms of how do I stay safe, how do I take care of my family, how do I be with other people. Not that it was all pleasant, but it wasn't really that difficult to access what seemed to be good knowledge, actionable knowledge about what was going on and what you could do. But for another segment of the population, that was just not even on the table for them. It was like from the beginning, it was like nothing good is going to come out of this. There's nothing that can be done. You can't trust anybody. It's all BS. And in some ways, that was just flabbergasting, and because I had to deal with it in my own family. So there was, social media didn't create that, I don't think. I don't know what did. I mean, I suppose I could make some guesses, but I just think there's something deeper and maybe darker going on. So
I would largely agree.
To the question originally, I guess I think of, the Greeks used to be very concerned with being able to write things down. People would lose their ability to think and to communicate orally. And when television came, there was a lot of concern about television ruining society. And I think even when it went from phones where there was somebody listening in on the conversations, where you could have a phone conversation without an operator listening in, like there were concerns about that. There's always concerns about technology, and I think it can be used in negative ways or amplify that. But then there's questions like Jack Dorsey, who's helped start Twitter. He was concerned recently that the internet
is too unified and it needed, they thought it was gonna be more diversified, and now corporations have overtaken the unity of the internet, and that's, he thinks that's the real problem. And that has to do with social media and all those things, but there's a lot of different complex questions, I think. So it's hard to just pin, but I do think most of these things can probably be used for good too, some way or another. So it's not like this is evil or that evil, but how we use them maybe is not very smart and doesn't really help. And I don't know how to help us always use it the right way, but I'm just here to say, yeah, the phone isn't the evil thing. Just like guns don't kill people, people kill people. Phones don't destroy society, but we destroy society through our phones.
Right, and that goes back to what I was saying, with this argument, is technology is just a tool. It's just a tool that was developed for other reasons, like to help us advance our objectives. But technology is a tool, it's not, social media is evil, what people do is.
When you spread
But it's also
misinformation,
good, sorry, it's also good.
yeah, when you have people purposely spreading misinformation, I mean, we have relatives who are nurses, lifelong nurses. One of my aunts ran her public county health department and she was anti-vax. And we're like, that's scary. Where are you getting your information from? And when you have people purposely sowing division, fear, misinformation, and anybody can contribute to the discourse, even though it could be absolute garbage or not peer reviewed. That's what, I think it opens doors for inclusivity, but it can be scary dangerous when it's not being monitored, filtered, or just the sheer amount of garbage information that's been spread. I think that's what we need to, we don't have truth. Everybody has their own truth of, effectiveness. They're not looking at scientific studies or the studies that have been done on, vaccine effectiveness or other, mitigation techniques. It's all been warped. And I think that's what, we don't have a rudder or foundation. It's just all kind of out there. Whoever's screaming the loudest or most controversial are getting the attention and the clicks and the contracts. And we're just kind of perpetuating this extreme, misinformation or extreme shock value instead of getting down to a decent civil discourse of what's the information and what is the wisest way forward. We've kind of lost our capacity for wisdom and it just kind of shifted focus.
I think we have time for a concluding response. We have more or less ran out of time. I do want to also give my co-chair an opportunity to add anything if you Reed has anything to add, but.
No, I think we covered everything.
Any last thoughts?
No, Heather, well said, and I just very much appreciate everybody's willingness to work just with me here, and I appreciate all your comments and questions as well. I very much enjoyed the conversation. So thank you all.
Thank
You can't fix
Pamela was going to do that.
Oh, that's right.